On May 19th, Statistics Canada released the April CPI print. The headline read 2.8% year over year, modest by recent standards, almost reassuring. Then I scrolled down one line to gasoline, up 28.6%. And the rest of the print stopped mattering, because that single line changes the math on every dollar of safe money sitting in Canadian cash accounts, GICs, and short-duration bond funds right now. The Bank of Canada knows this. The Bank of Canada also cannot fix it. Not with hikes, not with holds, not with cuts. Over the next 20 minutes, I will show you exactly what April's print does to your portfolio, why the bank is genuinely stuck at 2.25%, and the four-step adjustment that separates investors who preserve purchasing power from investors who watch their statements grow while their grocery bills outpace them. Bring a calculator. The numbers are going to surprise you. Let me name what is actually inside that 28.6% gasoline number. Statistics Canada's release breaks it down. Middle East supply disruptions pushed Brent crude above $98 a barrel in mid-April, and Canadian wholesale gasoline followed. The Canadian dollar's softness against the US dollar, sitting around 73 cents through April, amplified the pass-through into pump prices. None of those three forces, geopolitical supply risk, the loonie, refined product margins, are things the Bank of Canada can change with monetary policy. That is the first thing to internalize. A central bank's policy rate is a tool for managing domestic demand. When inflation is being imported through energy prices set in another hemisphere, the rate tool barely touches it. Hiking would crush domestic demand without reducing imported energy costs. Cutting would weaken the loonie further and amplify the imported inflation. The bank is genuinely stuck in a way the 2022 to 2023 cycle never required it to be. This brings us to the part that matters for your portfolio. Stagflation, by the textbook definition, is the simultaneous presence of three conditions: inflation above target, growth below trend, and unemployment trending up or stable at elevated levels. April's print confirms condition 1, 2.8% versus the bank's 2% target. The Bank of Canada's April 2026 Monetary Policy Report, released April 16th, forecasts 1.2% real GDP growth for 2026, well below the Canadian economy's roughly 1.8% trend rate. That is condition 2. Statistics Canada's labor force survey through April shows unemployment near 7%. That is condition 3. All three conditions met simultaneously. This is not a sentence I write lightly. By the standard academic definition, Canada is now in stagflation territory. The last time the Bank of Canada faced this configuration was 1981, and the playbook from that era, Volcker-style aggressive hiking, would tip a fragile Canadian economy into deep recession. There is no clean policy answer. There is only the choice of which side of the mandate to fail. It is worth pausing on what the 1970s stagflation actually did to Canadian portfolios, because the lesson is uncomfortable. Between 1973 and 1981, Canadian CPI averaged 9.4% annually. Long bond yields averaged 9.8% over the same period. On paper, fixed income looked like it was keeping pace. In reality, the real return on a 5-year Government of Canada bond, that is, the yield minus realized inflation, minus taxes at then prevailing marginal rates, was negative for 8 consecutive years. A Canadian retiree who held the supposedly safe fixed income portfolio through that decade lost roughly 30% of purchasing power. The equity side did worse on a nominal basis early in the cycle, but kept pace with inflation by the cycle's end. The asset that protected purchasing power most reliably across the 1973 to 1982 window was, counterintuitively, a portfolio of dividend-paying equities concentrated in commodity-producing sectors, which is to say, exactly the sectors most Canadian retirees underweight today. Let me show you what the after-tax, after-inflation math on a 4% Canadian GIC actually looks like in 2026. Take a 1-year GIC at 4%. That is roughly where the top advertised rate sits among the big banks today. Hold it in a non-registered account at a 40% marginal tax bracket, which is roughly where a middle-income Canadian sits in Ontario or BC. Federal and provincial tax on that 4% of interest income reduces your after-tax yield to 2.4%. Subtract April's 2.8% CPI. Your real after-tax return is negative 0.4%. You are paying the bank to hold your money. On a $100,000 GIC position, That is $400 of purchasing power lost every year. Hold it in a TFSA and you skip the tax. Your real return becomes positive, 1.2%. Hold it in an RRSP and the picture is more complex because the tax is deferred but the inflation drag is not. Across every account structure, the gap between nominal yield and real purchasing power is now wider than at any point since 2022. Here is the visual that should be on the wall of every Canadian financial planner right now. This chart plots the real after-inflation return on 3 Canadian fixed-income instruments from 2020 to today. The blue line is a one-year GIC ladder held in a TFSA. The orange line is the same instrument held in a non-registered account at a 40% marginal bracket. The green line is the Government of Canada 5-year bond yield minus current CPI. Watch what happens after April 2026's print lands on the right edge. The non-registered GIC line drops below zero, meaning the saver is now losing purchasing power, even with rates this high. The 5-year government bond's real yield falls to roughly 1.1%, barely positive after the CPI revision. The TFSA-held GIC line is the only one comfortably positive, at 1.2% real. This is the cost of imported energy inflation. It does not show up in your statement's headline number. It shows up here, quietly, line by line, until the saver opens their account 5 years from now and asks where the purchasing power went. Now the part that surprised me. The Government of Canada 5-year yield, sitting at roughly 3.9% through April, has not adjusted much to April's CPI surprise. The bond market is doing something interesting. It is pricing this print as a transient energy shock, not a structural inflation reacceleration. Bond traders look at the core CPI ex-energy ex-food number, that was 2.4% in April, and conclude the Bank of Canada will not need to hike. They may be right. They may also be wrong. Because if energy prices stay elevated through the third quarter, the second-order pass-through to wages, transportation costs, and food prices will lift core CPI by Q4. That scenario, the energy shock leaking into core inflation, is the exact dynamic that turned the 1973 oil embargo into the persistent stagflation of the late 1970s. The bond market is making a bet that this time is different. Your portfolio, by holding nominal bonds at current yields, is implicitly making that same bet. The Bank of Canada's April Monetary Policy Report forecasts 1.2% real GDP growth for 2026. Read carefully through that document and the picture is bleaker than the headline number suggests. The bank's own analysis shows household consumption decelerating to under 1% annualized in the second half of the year. Business investment is forecast to contract by 0.4%. Net exports, which had been the lifeline of the Canadian economy, are projected flat as U.S. tariff policy continues to weigh on Canadian manufacturing exports. The only major contributor to positive GDP in the bank's base case is government spending, which is essentially the bank acknowledging that the federal fiscal stance is doing the work monetary policy cannot. A 1.2% GDP forecast in an economy this dependent on housing and consumer credit is genuinely close to recession territory. The bank cannot hike into this. The bank also cannot afford to let inflation expectations unanchor. Hence, 2.25% overnight rate held in place for as long as the bank can defend it. For Canadian equity investors, this environment has specific implications. Rate-sensitive sectors on the TSX, REITs, utilities, telecom, and pipeline operators have historically benefited from a steady rate environment. They are benefiting now. The S&P/TSX capped REIT index is up roughly 9% year-to-date through April. But beware, this is not the same setup as the 2014 to 2016 low-rate era. Then, rates were low because growth was anemic and inflation was below target. Today, rates are low relative to inflation because the bank is choosing to fail on inflation rather than on growth. That choice can reverse in a single press conference. If the bank moves to a hiking posture, even 1/4 point, rate-sensitive sectors will reprice violently. The TSX REIT index lost 22% in the 4 months following the bank's first hike in 2022. The lesson: do not confuse a bank that cannot hike with a bank that will not hike. The environment that benefits these sectors is also the most fragile one they can sit in. This is the point in the analysis where the conventional advice, own bonds, own cash, hold GICs, starts to fail. The reasoning behind safe assets assumes that nominal preservation equals purchasing power preservation. That assumption works fine when inflation runs below 1.5% for 15 straight years, which is the regime most Canadian financial advisors learn their craft in. It does not work when inflation runs at 2.8%, with a 28.6% gasoline component, and a Bank of Canada that cannot raise rates. The conventional 60/40 portfolio, 60% equity, 40% bonds, was constructed in an inflation regime that no longer exists. Holding it unchanged through this environment is not staying the course. It is making an unhedged bet that inflation reverts inside 12 months. Maybe it does, maybe it does not, but that bet should be conscious, not default. The investors who got hurt worst in the 1970s were the ones who kept doing exactly what had worked for 20 years before, long after the regime had quietly shifted underneath them. Here is the single distinction that makes this entire framework work, and it is the one your bank will never say out loud. Safe in nominal terms and safe in real terms are now two different things. The 4 steps that follow are built on that distinction. A GIC is safe in nominal terms. You will receive your principal plus stated interest at maturity. A GIC is not safe in real terms when after-tax yield is below CPI. You will receive less purchasing power than you deposited. For 30 years, those two definitions converged because inflation was tame. They diverge now. Once you accept that divergence as the operating reality, your portfolio decisions change. You stop optimizing for nominal stability and start optimizing for real purchasing power preservation. That single mental shift is what separates investors who keep up with the cost of living from investors who watch their balances grow on paper while their grocery bills outpace them. Hold that distinction in mind for the next 4 steps. It is the lens through which each one should be evaluated. Step 1. Audit your cash position. Identify how much you hold in non-registered cash accounts, money market funds, and GICs maturing within 12 months. Calculate the after-tax real return on each tranche using your actual marginal bracket and April's 2.8% CPI. If the number is negative, and for most non-registered cash positions at top marginal rates it now is, quantify the annual purchasing power loss in dollar terms. A $100,000 non-registered GIC position at negative 0.4% real return is bleeding $400 of purchasing power per year. That is the figure to confront, not the 4% on the statement. Step 2. Reallocate emergency cash to the most tax-efficient registered envelope available. TFSA contribution room, if you have it, converts a 0.4% real loss into a 1.2% real gain on the same instrument. That is a 1.6 percentage point swing for the cost of moving the money. If your TFSA is full, GIC interest held in an RRSP defers the tax drag, though it does not eliminate the inflation drag. Sequence matters. TFSA first, RRSP second, non-registered last. Now to the active side of the framework. Step 3. Add a real return asset to the fixed income sleeve. Government of Canada real return bonds, RRBs, pay a coupon indexed to CPI. Their real yield is currently around 1.7%. They are not without complexity. They trade in thin volume, they are taxed inefficiently outside registered accounts, and the underlying duration is long. But they do one thing that nominal bonds cannot. They preserve real purchasing power by contract, not by hope. A 10 to 15% allocation to RRBs within a fixed income sleeve hedges the inflation regime risk that the rest of the bond portfolio is exposed to. Step 4. Diversify the equity sleeve towards sectors that historically benefit from a bank cannot hike environment. Energy producers, TSX-listed names with reserves on the balance sheet, are a direct hedge against the imported energy inflation that drove this CPI print. Canadian financials, by contrast, face a margin squeeze in a flat-rate environment. The portfolio that protected purchasing power from 1973 to 1982 was equity-weighted to commodity producers, light on duration, with a 10 to 15% real return fixed income sleeve. That is closer to where a portfolio for this regime should sit than the textbook 60/40. Pull all of this together. April 2026 produced a 2.8% CPI print with a 28.6% gasoline component. The Bank of Canada forecasts 1.2% GDP growth for 2026, with unemployment near 7%. That is the textbook stagflation configuration. The bank cannot hike without breaking the economy. The bank cannot ignore inflation without unanchoring expectations. So the rate sits at 2.25%, and the inflation pressure runs through your real returns instead. The conventional safe haven assets, cash, GICs, short bonds, protect nominal value while quietly losing purchasing power. The four-step adjustment: audit cash, reallocate to tax-efficient envelopes, add real return bonds, rebalance equity toward commodity producers, is what an institutional fixed income desk would do facing this environment. It is what your portfolio should do too. The bank cannot fix this. You can. That is the framework. For deeper analysis on what April's print means for Canadian portfolios, including the full research note that backs the calculations in this video, visit QuintArth.com. QuintArth is the institutional finance brand for Canadian and US investors who want analysis without the hype. If this video helped you think more clearly about real versus nominal returns, the subscribe button below sends a clear signal to YouTube to keep producing it. The next CPI